Hey everybody, welcome back. Welcome to week, I don't know, 10-ish of the semester. Depending how you count your weeks. Um, from my perspective, I'm coming towards the end. I mean, I know my semester ends before yours, which ends before the TAs, but I've only got a couple weeks of stuff left to talk about because, frankly, I know at this point in the semester, the lectures become a sideshow. What you are and should be worrying about more is the project. So I guess by the time you see this, I will have given you some feedback on the project proposal. As I record this, I'll finish that later today. There's a project checkpoint coming up. That's really more about like, let's make sure you're working on the project. It's sort of a, it's a milestone for its own sake because I want you to be making progress at this point with your group. Couple more exercises to worry about, but mostly the project. For my part, I want to talk about URLs and REST today, whatever time of day you watch this, and then some more client-side stuff next week. So I guess let's go. URLs and REST, I mean, in my head, these are twin topics. I know not for most people, but maybe I'll convince you that they're related as today goes on. So let's start with URLs, which, I mean, are such a fundamental thing. I don't even know if I defined URL in this course. They're just a thing that we know, right? They're this thing that's up in the address bar of your web browser. This thing that you do when you're doing routing on either the server side or client side. And I think sometimes they end up being, they just end up fading into the background, even for web developers. I think they deserve a little thought and a little care, and that's why I want to talk about it here. So again, let's drop back to some basics. What is it about URLs? Like, what are they? What are they for? What are they doing? First, I guess, again, URL fact is that they're opaque. And in this context, opaque means that they're just a string. There's not any meaning here, right? So this URL, okay, there's a little meaning, right? There's a protocol, there's which server the thing is coming from. But this path part of the URL is just some characters as far as HTTP is concerned, right? So for the protocol, that's just an identifying string. Like somehow it identifies a resource that the client is asking for so that the server can produce it. I don't know that it's about it products or wrenches or that it's HTML or that it's static. Like all of those things are not really required. It's just a string. This might be a JPEG image of like somebody's vacation. I don't know. Just a URL that points to some content. That's all. So I might have, like as a user, I might have an opinion about what this URL is all about. But again, for the protocol and for the moment, it's just the path part of the URL. It's a string. All the other decisions we get to make in the future. One of the things I heard myself say back there is that these things are identifying content. So that URL is pointing to content. Like I imagine that's like a description of a product, somebody selling a wrench or whatever. But it doesn't have to be. It's content. So again, like HTTP uses this word resource to mean effectively a piece of content. Not necessarily a file, not necessarily like HTML or JPEG, just this sort of higher level concept of like this piece of information. So the job of the URL is to identify that content. Again, there's this a sort of higher level, like, okay, there's the vacation picture. And the URL gives us all a way to sort of talk about that piece of content and make it distinct from any other piece of content that's out there on the web. That's the URL's job at this higher level. Fundamentally, it's identifying content. Again, one thing, like I haven't, well, frankly, and I'm in general not careful about these terms if I'm honest, URL versus URI. So locator versus identifier. So this description back here where it identifies a piece of content, that's true of any URI, Uniform Resource Identifier. And maybe an example is more useful than anything. So all the HTTP URLs are also URIs and vice versa. But this URI, it's a resource identifier, is not a URL locator. So a URL is something that you can kind of mechanically use to get the content, right? So if I tell you this URL, or frankly, if you tell a web browser that URL, the web browser knows what to do. A few seconds later, you're looking at content. This URI identifies this, I assume, book by ISBN and an ISBN number here. So there's some content there. It doesn't tell me anything about how to find it. I guess I walk down the street to the library and I tell the librarian I want this ISBN number, or I go to Amazon or whatever. That's not implied by every URI. URIs that are also URLs do have that implication of like, here's how you can sort of have code get that content. So again, like URL is a subset of URI, which, and again, on the web for HTTP, everything is both, which is why I tend to be a little sloppy about it. Those two terms. Okay, so we have a URL that identifies content because it's also a URI. And we know a web browser can go and fetch the content because it's a URL. But what's going to come back, right? So I say, implicitly, right, if I copy and paste this into the thing and I press enter, I find out, of course, that URL's fake. But what am I going to get back that describes that content, that contains that content, I guess? And it's a file format. So this is the representation part of the story, which is, well, probably I expected that URL to come back with some HTML content, a page with a price and a description and a picture, whatever you expect for a product description. It might have been a PDF. We all know those websites of like, oh, here's our product catalog, good luck. That's a less awesome representation of that content, I would say, but I can imagine either one. And in fact, I guess if I'm looking at a product description in HTML, I know I can convert that to a PDF. So in some ways, these representations they're just representations of the same content. So one resource can have more than one representation. As a developer, author, whatever, you choose the representation. In the same way that I guess I could have hit that URL and just got like, here's a picture of it. That's all. That's the entire description of that product is just here's an image. All of these are reasonable. Even things that are a little more like behind the scenes style sheets, there's at least conceptually different ways to represent a style sheet. In practice on the web, there's only one that really gets used, but who knows what the future brings, right? 10 years from now, the W3C decides, what, this CSS business has reached the end of the line. We're going to introduce this whole new style sheet language, maybe. And then it would be the same content, conceptually the same information about what does an H1 look like, what does a paragraph look like, with a different representation. So again, on the technical side, URLs identify content. Content is called a resource. And then it has to be represented somehow so it can be delivered to the user and presumably displayed by the web browser or whatever else. That's what URLs are, basically. And of course, we know them as all of this other stuff. There's some implications of that URLs as URIs, they should be identifying. And identifying is this, really, that there's some one-to-one mapping between pieces of content and URLs. And I guess, well, I'll ask you to think back to Mac 101. You remember how you proved something was a one-to-one correspondence? Sorry, I know the look that would be on people's faces if this was an in-person class. Whatever. I'll tell you what they are if you forgot. So of course, you have to prove that something is both one-to-one and onto, that the one-to-one goes sort of in either direction. So for us, that URLs should be identifying, should be one-to-one to content. What that means is I should not have this. I should not have more than one URL that points to a single piece of content or resource. So there's a bunch of ways that can get weird and can go wrong, but maybe this is the most obvious one for people, and the one that you see, really out there in the world. A lot of websites have, the www version and the not, and either one will resolve. Like, I don't know what happens actually. Like if I go to google.ca, okay, in that case I get redirected. So they have sort of decided that www is the canonical URL. If I go to google.ca, I get I get a redirect to the www. Okay, so that's probably the right behavior. They do not have two separate URLs for this same piece of conceptual content. Good, but of course we all know sites where that's not the case, where both of these just work and look like they return the same content, but well, I'm not sure, and certainly any like in a technical way you can't be sure. And like the same thing is true, anything where you can go to like /index.html, and that is true on this site. The index.html and the no path in the URL are the same content. They're different URLs. And again, I know they're the same content because I know how that server is configured. Again, no automated tool can make that assumption. They shouldn't be. And you'll notice, like, I never, even though that URL does work, it's never used anywhere in any of my sites because I'm even though this is technically there, I'm trying to avoid it. And for a bunch of reasons, one of them is just confusing. Like I have these two things. Like if I'm going to send a URL to my friend, does it matter which one? Like is one updated differently than the other? They look the same today. Who knows? It means that you're going to get hit twice. Like that same URL is going to get indexed by Google because it doesn't know that those happen to be the same, or they will happen to be the same tomorrow. One of the things that I think this should be the killer argument to not do this. And of course, what I'm campaigning for here is that you don't do this on your own site. So the Google PageRank algorithm, which I don't know, may or may not be the way they actually index. It's certainly the way that they index pages is based on PageRank. Okay, the details of which I don't care about. What matters is pages get a score. Higher PageRank is better. The that score is based on the number of incoming links, among other things. So if you have 5 URLs that happen to be to the same content, oh well, maybe a fifth of the pages that link to you and give you credibility point to each one. So none of your pages' page ranks will be very high. If you had one URL, all of that page rank would be concentrated. You would have a better page as far as Google's concerned. You want that. Caching works less well. Again, if the HTTP cache can't decide that those are the same content, even if they might look the same at the moment. So you split your cache sort of usability, I guess, utilization. This blog post is on this point, must be separately crawled. Again, I will summarize. What's happening here is, it's somebody's photo gallery or whatever it was. Every photo has a different URL depending how you get to it. It's part of this collection, or you're getting it at this size, or whatever it is. And it ended up, by the time you did that, again, Mac of 101, like how many combinations are there? 9,000 and some URLs for each piece of content. So the search engines were trying to crawl more than 500,000 pages on a site, even though there are actually, or sorry, 6 million pages on the site, even though there are actually a very much smaller number of pieces of content, the search engine is going to try to hit all of them. And I think this story starts with like, why is Google hitting me so hard? Why is Google like trying to denial of service me? And it's because it was trying to find all the URLs on the site and doing so dutifully. So before I move on, some of this is just be consistent, right? So like I said, like on my website, I know that the URLs that end in a slash are pointing to an index.html because they're just static and that's how the web server is configured. I am just consistent, right? So I didn't solve the technical problem there. I just picked one and used it. So if you do have this thing, and again, even just the www dot versus the top level URL, you probably should do what Google did, which is redirect from one to the other. Just decide that one is a canonical URL. There is a way to specify that in HTML, where I don't know if this is even going to be like Amazon's URLs and which are, this is the one that I found one time. That's a really long URL, and it turns out like it's not all required, right? So the keywords is just what to highlight from the search. So if I delete that part of the URL, well, I get the same content. Like for whatever reason with slightly different whatevers. And I think I can keep going, right? So, and like whatever this is, maybe I can change, maybe it's just numbers. Can I change it to other numbers? Yes. So I can probably just delete it. And I think I've done this before, and I can actually delete back to there and get the same piece of content, because this is probably the book's ISBN number or like product number or whatever. It's probably the thing that actually matters here. It is at least related to the ISBN number. So what can be done here is that there can be a canonical URL, and I don't know if Amazon is doing this or not. Can I search in this? Yeah. So there is a canonical URL. It is that, which is different again. No, okay, it's actually the one that I discovered. But I kind of had to discover it, which was weird. And again, how do I know that, again, a search engine that discovers this URL because somebody linked to it has to crawl it just so they can get that canonical URL from the page and then decide, oh, this is actually the same thing. I can throw it away. But your page is still going to get hit. So it's a partial solution, but not awesome. Kind of want to avoid that. So again, be consistent, decide what your URLs are and stick with it. Okay, so the other thing that, the other way that a one-to-one correspondence can go wrong is the, I forget whichever one is one-to-one and onto, it's the other one. So that's something like this, right? Where I have one URL, like I'm not changing URLs as I click through different content here on these tabs. So I'm changing, I have a different fragment here, but not a different base URL. All of these things are the same URL, but different content. So how do I refer to one is really the problem here. And I mean, Flash is dead, yay, but it was always a problem there too, where you have this like effectively whole site possibly with all the navigation and everything else, but one URL. In that case, like you need URLs for your content because nobody can link to it. I mean, I've said Google in the slide, but I can't link to it. Google can't link to it. Nobody can link to it. you can't bookmark it. And like, we've all been through this, right? This like, oh, hey, can you send me that really cool thing? Sure. Here's a URL. Oh, okay. You have to go to the URL, scroll about 2/3 of the way down, and then there's these tabs, and you have to click the tab labeled cool thing. And that sucks. Like, that's not the way to have your website be discoverable by people and usable by people. This is not awesome. And we can do better. And we have URLs to do better with. And this is something that, frankly, the front-end frameworks promote the wrong thing. The easy thing to do with most front-end frameworks is to have that single page app where there's one URL and then everything. And it's not a good website if you do that. So you can get around it, but you need the front-end framework to help you undo the damage it did. And this is like, you can sort of play games with the history API, which is basically like, where is it? How do I see my history? Yeah, like, these pages that I've clicked through, you can modify that list with JavaScript, which is what this history API is doing. And then you need like the URL that you inject into the location bar up here, which is effectively what this history API lets you do. Then you need that URL to actually work. And I've seen a lot of student projects like this where it looks like there's URLs, right? So as I click around the site, there's a whole bunch of front-end framework, React or Vue or whatever doing work. URLs keep changing up in the thing, but then if I copy and paste that URL into another tab, it doesn't work. And that is a super bad outcome. Like, I've had people ask in various ways, what's your favorite front-end framework? Do I need a front-end framework? And I keep saying no, and I feel like people don't believe me when I say that. Like, you know what works? Web pages, URLs, and HTML. So if you're going to present me with an alternative to that, it better be better than the thing it's replacing. And I am not convinced at all that the front-end frameworks are better than the thing they replace, which is web pages. And again, the web page for the front-end framework says, oh, it's so much faster because we can build the page client side. You better prove to me that that's faster. Like, I already can build a page client side by delivering them HTML. Is the thing the front-end framework is doing faster than that? Okay, you can rebuild a page without a full page reload. Why is a page reload slow? Does it have to be? Can it be quick? Oh, you can deliver JSON instead of HTML. Why is that better? You'd better prove to me that, okay, I have some data on the server side. I can either take it, I can put it into an HTML template and deliver the template, or I can turn it into JSON and deliver the JSON. I don't see why delivering JSON is a priori faster. It definitely can be, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have to be. It's not like, it's not something that you can just say like citation needed. And then, okay, if you're going to build a single page application with a big front-end framework, well, what used to work is links and URLs. And now I have to start writing code to make links and URLs work. Why do you make me write that code? It already worked. And then I broke it. And then I feel like I've accomplished something by writing, turning on some plugin and API and doing a bunch of routing work so that URLs work again. Stop it. Anyway. Sorry, I've drifted off topic. What was I talking about? URLs identifying content. And I think this is another, and I didn't put the link here. What is it? Cool, your eyes don't change. This concept of like the URI, URL on the web, should be persistent. It should be a persistent identifier to that content. All I ask is that a URL work between the time you publish it and the end of the universe. It's a small ask, right? We can all manage this. That takes a little bit of, I guess, software engineering, right? You have to plan your URLs well enough that your site can grow around them without changing them, hopefully. or if things do have to move, you leave redirects behind. And that's, again, like, I'm aware, like, this is not a trivial thing to do, but you should do it. You certainly should attempt to do it. And I feel like a lot of web developers don't even try. Like, this always bugs me. And Spark, the big data framework, their documentation URLs just completely changed. Every link in my slides is now broken. That's not an awesome experience from someone who's trying to, like, is implicitly promoting this framework by teaching it to students. Like, you've broken my everything. Every assignment, every slide link is now broken because the identification of that content in a URL, they decided to change it and did not leave redirects behind, and it's super annoying. Okay, moving off that high horse to another one. I started today by saying this: these URLs are opaque. They're just an identifying string with no special meaning to the protocol, right? And so that for the protocol, I think, is an important distinction. For HTTP, like, all of these are equally good URLs, assuming I make my site so they work. Which one of these is good for the user? Like, this one, I think we know we can guess, right? That we're selling things and it's a wrench. This, not so useful. This, like, you have a UUID or something in there, it'll work. Like, this is an identifier, presumably, in whatever system I'm imagining here. It's not a very human readable one. So if URLs are not technically important, or like what the string is not technically important, but it is user visible, it must be user interface, right? In the same way that, like, if you have you have a window with, I don't even know a GUI framework. You're doing a thing that draws windows and buttons on the screen. You can put the OK button, here. It doesn't matter where that OK button goes, but you should put it in the place that users expect it. That's just good user interface. There's no technical reason. It's a UI reason. So, like, my assertion here is that URLs matter. Users read URLs. And my proof is Google puts them there. Like, this is it's not like this is just a random crap that Google threw on a page. Like, Google has thought very carefully about what should appear here. And the URL is, like, front and center, right? So it's a Twitter URL or whatever. And the same in Bing and the same in DuckDuckGo. URLs are important enough that all of these search engines feel like it's important enough information to show. Users read URLs, even non-technical users. Like, I know I read URLs. I take it from this that other users do too, so they should be useful for users. And, like, I'm not the first one to think of this by a long shot. Jacob Nielsen was one of the first people to really do usability work on the web. And, like, this article is ancient, right? This is older than some of you. And he knew it then, and he's been saying it since then, and we should have been listening since then. Every little while it gets rediscovered, right? This blog post is from 18 years later, and says basically the same thing. So my assertion is that URLs should be designed as user interface, right? For users, not for technology, because they don't have to be designed for technology. The technology doesn't care. In the same way that technology doesn't care where your OK button is in the window. So they should be, and at this point I'm really boring from this post. But they should be human readable. They should be kind of meaningful. They should be short enough that they can fit in a tweet or in an email, like in one line on an email. All of those things that kind of make URLs nice to work with and look at and everything else. So how do you think your site is organized? How is information related? Can you reflect that in the URL? So something like a URL shortener is not, like, that's a perfectly fine URL. It goes somewhere and it and I guess I'm imagining here that it redirects to there. This is maybe a slightly more meaningful URL, but I don't really know. Like, I don't have that authority that it is an official URL. Like, all of these things that URL tells me are not really told by these URL shorteners. There's reasons that sometimes you need a really short URL, but avoid if possible. Because again, it strips all that information out. At the same time, like I said, sometimes you need a really short URL. You want it to fit, well, okay, like Twitter automatically URL shortens things, or like, what does it do? It shows the URL in the tweet, but the link actually goes to their URL shortener, probably so they can log who's clicking on what. But then it's not the whole URL, it's only the first N characters of it. Well, if it's short enough, maybe, again, you can convey all the information there. One thing that is not awesome in a URL and just, visually ugly is the things that get encoded. Right. So, I don't know, a space character is not allowed to appear in a URL, so it gets encoded as %20. It's the, the UTF-8 encoding of the character encoded in hexadecimal with a % sign is what's going on there. And so, things like this, right? So the British pound sign, when you UTF-8 encode it, it's 2 bytes. So you get 2 of these. That's really ugly in a URL if what you meant was that. I was about to say the annoying thing. I don't know that that's true. So if I try to go to this URL, my web browser, like, I don't know if you can see what's going on there, and I can't even, like, if I try to copy and paste this URL, I get the ugly one back. That's not what it looks like on screen. What it looks like on screen is that. So the thing that's happening here is this is not a legal URL. URLs cannot contain Chinese characters, just the way of the world. For better or worse, this is the real URL. Again, it's these characters, UTF-8 encoded, and then anything that's not legal within a URL, percent encoded. Okay, like, this is a legal URL, this is not, but the web browser makes it look like that because this is so ugly. But if I copy and paste it and email it to somebody, it's going to look like this. That's, again, another level of confusing for users. I really want to avoid it. So the things that are safe in URLs are, context dependent. The path part of URL and the domain name and the query string all have different rules for what characters are allowed without escaping. But I think really probably lowercase letters and digits and the dash. You can put an underscore in there, but why confuse? Dashes tend to be more common in URLs. And then the slash to build a hierarchy of sites, or a hierarchy within the site. I think that's probably what you get to use in URLs. Sorry, non-English speakers, but URLs are what they are. I didn't make the choice. So the one thing out of all this that maybe is not completely just an identifying string is the slash. And again, as far as HTTP is concerned, strictly speaking, these URLs are not related. I think they're related because they have most of their path component is the same, and they only differ in this last bit. But again, as far as like what goes from the client to the server, it's like, hey, here's an identifying string. Can you send me the content? And the server sends it back. But the slash does have this meaning, right? It's like, so you can use relative URLs. You can kind of go up a level, in a level. There is something to that slash, and it means path hierarchy, basically. And again, I think we knew that. But again, it's sort of there and sort of not, that this is something within that. And we think of it that way. And again, I think most users do think of URLs having that semantics to it, even though in a technical sense, it doesn't have to. So, okay, use that assumption. I feel like this is all of like usability, right? Like the thing the user assumes, steer into it. Users think slashes mean hierarchy. Okay, so use it to build hierarchy. There is some relationship between these two pieces of content. They're both slides in Compute 470. Okay, so I built a path hierarchy that reflects that. So again, something like I don't think this is unusual or surprising, I guess, but remember it when you're putting your site together. And I guess, by the way, some of the reason I'm talking about this now is you're doing a project right now. You are, or your group is, or implicitly, or whatever, these are getting designed as part of your project. And my suspicion is a lot of you haven't been designing them so much as just there's some defaults and you're going with it. Maybe this is a good moment to stop and think, like, what is going on here? Like, what do the URLs of our site mean? What are they for? Do they make sense? And this, like, okay, so this is like the Ruby on Rails kind of defaults. I think Rails still has that default. I should do a toy project in Rails sometime. I'm a little out of date on it, but Rails either has or had this default routes.rb that is mysite.com/model/id/verb, right? So I have a model class called product or products. It has a primary key ID, just a numeric auto increment, and then the scaffolding builds, a show and a create and whatever other URLs within that. So this is just the default that it would produce. It's not a bad default, but I don't care. Like, primary keys in databases are not something users probably care about. Like, this is not meaningful. This is meaningful, right? If I have a product and it's called Hammer, to a user, that's much more useful than 123 as a name for it. And then maybe there's stuff inside it. And again, this is not reflected in the defaults because, well, how could it be? The framework doesn't know that you're about to create a relationship between products and products have options. But you do, right? So you know that, okay, well, this option that is the color of the thing or whatever in my story here is actually part of a specific product, and there's a primary key from options to products. You know that, and you can design these URLs to sort of reflect that relationship. It builds the right picture in your user's head of how your site is laid out. And I guess maybe this is the thing, these are good defaults. Again, like, I'm not knocking Rails here for having this default. I'm knocking developers for just blindly accepting the default and not diving into that routes.rb file to figure out what's going on and what should be there. This is a bit of a, straw man. Like, you don't see this kind of thing as much anymore, but this kind of, like, there is a file on disk. And this web server has been configured so that somehow this file on disk is not sent literally, it's executed. Like, that piece of code runs, capture the output, send it back, like it's a CGI script from 15 years ago or whatever. And there's a query string that passes some information in. So again, you don't see this as commonly anymore, maybe a little more commonly in the PHP world, but these URLs are definitely still out there, and it's a sort of, I don't know, it's really an example of a URL that's designed for developers, not for users. This is probably reflecting some sort of directory structure in the code base that I have, like this module package, whatever it's called. Inside that, I have some functionality, and I, as the developer, named the file showperson.py or .php or whatever. So that code runs, and it takes the query string part of the URL as input. It's a good technical story, but completely unrelated to what users care about. As a user, well, I don't care about modules and packages and whatever in your code. Well, I'm making a GET request, so show is implied. And I think this is probably my argument back here too. Like, I know I'm trying to show something because I typed a URL. The whole point of, like, typing URL, clicking URL or typing it or copying and pasting it, all of those things are, mapped to a GET request. So implicitly, you're always just trying to retrieve information there. The word show is not meaningful in this context. I don't care that it's written Python, PHP, or whatever. I don't care that ID is the name of the primary key in the database. I don't really care that 237 is the primary key of that record. This is probably the only meaningful word in that URL, or maybe, again, I get this sort of authority that it's from this site, right? This site is the one producing the information. I know whose information I'm accessing, and I'm accessing information about a person. That's what I learned from this mess of a URL. I don't care about all the rest of it. This URL is equally, again, technically equally good, but much more human friendly, right? So again, I care about the domain. I'm looking for a person, and I have a more human readable string that identifies that record, presumably, than the database primary key. I don't care about database primary keys as a user. So, oh, and I guess, right, the hierarchy, right? So there's this hierarchy implied here that's meaningful to me, the user, because there's probably, you know, if that URL exists, maybe this one is a collection of all people, and maybe this one is somebody else. That would be pretty reasonable and guessable. And in fact, guessable is one of the things that Nielsen suggests here somewhere. Oh, hackable is the way he phrased it. Which again, I've seen non-technical people actually do this. Like go to URL, and in just sheer confusion of the weirdness of the site, they can't find their way around. Do that and hit enter, and try to sort of navigate to the higher level concept that they're imagining. That's like it's sort of like I really noted it when I saw somebody do it, and I'm like, wait a minute, how did you know to do that? Why did you do that? And it's because they were hoping that the hierarchy in the URLs was meaningful, and whether it was in that story or not, I don't remember. But right, so there might be a deeper hierarchy there too, right? So there might be this idea of I'm looking at that page, but you know, whatever it is that people have, they have phone numbers, or they have email, or they have, I don't know, whatever facts do you store about people? Like all of those things might be sort of sub information within this person, obviously depending on the site. This is one thing, and one thing I will say I have struggled with when doing this sort of thing and saying, okay, well, what URL do I want for this concept? It's very easy to get yourself like 4, 5, 6, 7 levels deep because you have a bunch of nested information on your site. A really deep hierarchy is just going to mean a really long URL, and that can start to suck. Again, like you start to get past what fits in one line in an email, what can be easily like sent in a, you know, the WhatsApp message or whatever. You want to keep this within reason. And again, I think my example here is probably Wikipedia. You know, this catalog of all of the world's information, asterisk, has really 2 URL components. It's what language am I looking at? It has this completely meaningless URL component. Like I know I'm on wikipedia.org. Like the /wiki I don't like in the URL. It would be nice if it was dropped. And then I'm looking at something called Vancouver. Well, okay, there's more than one concept with that name. There's the city in Oregon. There's apparently, well, there's electoral district. There's a steamboat, which is what I have in this slide. Okay, so they kind of have 2.5 path components that are meaningful. There's the disambiguation thing in parentheses. So you could imagine, like, I think they've done well. Like, don't get me wrong. I feel like that would be a nicer URL for this concept. Or maybe the disambiguation could be like that. Like there's some default thing here. or I want the more specific version of this concept to disambiguate. Like, I think these would be slightly more beautiful URLs, but they fundamentally have 3 path components, maybe 2 depending on the page. So if they can do it, I guess my point, like if Wikipedia can do it in 2 or 3 path components, like maybe having 4 in a really simple site like this is starting to push what is reasonable. But man, sometimes you just have deeply nested data and you have to represent it somehow. So I guess as I move a little bit on here, think about this now. Like, think about it for your project that you're presumably implementing now, and you're implementing URLs now. Think about it when next project time comes, when you're making the website, you know, as a project in another course, or you're starting something at the company or whatever. Give a little thought to URLs as part of your design, in the same way that you think, presumably, you hopefully think about your models and what database tables you need, and you think about how your code's going to be laid out, how you're going to break your functionality up into files and modules and whatever your programming language has. Think about your URLs as part of that initial design as well. Yeah, okay. So again, these tools that are doing the implementing, basically what's happening here is a request comes in. There's a front end server, there's an application server. The application server is communicating with your code using some piece of technology, some interface. Basically, you get a string, right? So in my story here, probably what's happening is this is just a string called path or path info that comes into your code or into your framework. After that, some programming is going to happen. You could, as a programmer, just take this string and start dealing with it. Probably your framework is going to have some kind of routing or URL configuration or dispatch, whatever your framework calls it, that's going to say, okay, well, this string points at this piece of code. Maybe a historical footnote here that often in this world of these stupid URLs that were there for technical reasons, not for UI reasons, mod rewrite got slapped on top of it to try to make a bad situation good. It can be done. It's this sort of mod rewrite in Apache, and there's similar things in Nginx or whatever, are this like basically arbitrary rewriting of like, when a URL that looks like this comes in, actually send it to this code. I don't think that's something that you want to do at the server level. Yeah, whenever I've seen it used, it's a nightmare of trying to rescue bad old PHP code. Maybe don't. In a modern framework, you can design well, and I shouldn't pick on PHP, because if you're using Laravel or something as a PHP framework, there is, again, I don't remember what they call it, but the routing and dispatching URL configuration is there, and you use it, and you say, well, strings that have this shape, call this function. Strings that have this shape, call that function. That's fundamentally what's happening in one of these frameworks. And again, I suspect I don't have to describe this too much because you've done it, right? You've had to do it on exercise 6 or 8 or whatever. These things are, what are these? Oh yeah, so these are the in 3 frameworks, the thing. So I have the application for Node, I guess the Express application that then is called by Node. You give this pattern that is :string is like a wildcard, and then this function will get called with year and post, like whatever the user puts in those positions as a string will get passed as an argument. Really the same format in Ruby on Rails. And then again, this code, like again, it's module and function name, or like module / controller and this function name, I believe, will get called when somebody requests a URL like that. Or in Django, the newer style is quite helpfully, they're doing the type conversion for you, right? Like, I expect this to look like an integer. Please convert it to an integer before you call my function. That would certainly be helpful. So again, a little bit of a restriction on what can go in that position, but hey, that might be nice. These are easy enough. And again, Rails has always presented this default. And, well, you can go change the default. I guess this is what I've been saying all along, and I don't have to repeat myself. One thing that you can do here is, should do here, is sort of remember, like, certainly as development is going on, as like early development is going on, you might guess wrong, you might design wrong. Like, I don't want to pretend that, you know, when you're putting your site together and you say, okay, I think my URL should look this way, especially as, again, you're just sort of starting up and you don't quite know how the pieces are going to fit together yet. Maybe it's not going to quite work out the way you thought. That's, I think if I was a software engineering instructor, I wouldn't say that, but hey, let's be honest. Sometimes you don't always predict right. So it's very easy to say, like, in your URL configuration, it's okay, it's going to be like /blog/year/post name or post ID or whatever it is. What you then shouldn't do is sort of hard code that into your templates or site, or, you know, wherever these URLs are coming from. What this means is that if I have to change that, like if I decide I want to change this, or I want to rearrange my hierarchy a little bit, or you know, slug should come before year or whatever else, I don't want to have to search and destroy, like, what is every place I've tried to link to one of these things in every template everywhere in my site and change it. Once it's deployed, I really can't change it because users are seeing those URLs, but as development is starting, I still have that flexibility. Repeating yourself like that, it's just bad code. So what I really want is, I want the thing that's conceptually correct here, which is, I want the URL that refers to a particular controller or view or whatever it is. And most frameworks, all full stack frameworks, this is one, like, I have not, I will admit, done the complete survey of everything here, but give you some way to do this, to say, well, what I mean is this piece of content. Probably that means controller or something in this world. This controller is what should be here, a URL that gets me to that piece of code. Figure it out for me. And this is one where, again, I think it can be a little bit hard to read here, but it's this piece of code is what I'm really talking about here. And it's this, okay, in Django, this view function, everybody else should hear me say controller there, this view function with these arguments, figure out the URL that will cause the user, like if the user clicks on it, they will go to that view function with those arguments, and it will build the string. So it'll basically reverse all of those URL configurations. The same kind of thing in Rails is, well, link to, and again, it's right, the blog controller, the function method named that with these arguments. How do I get there? And then this is the actual, like, contents of the link. Or right, this is the sort of behind the scenes functions in Django. The reverse function that, again, takes those arguments and returns the URL. It's what's being used to do this thing in a template. So those are there. And okay, it's going to take a couple minutes to figure it out if you're new to your framework and you don't know what the sort of local equivalent of these things are. But again, maybe do it. Like, it's once you figure out, like, once you have in your head how to build a URL by reversing the URL configuration, it ends up being easier. You just have to remember less about how your site is structured, and then use it. And then when it comes time, if you do have to sort of rearrange things, it's easy. And you only have one place to change. One place is the correct number of places to change for something like that. You can, you can treat your code as much more sort of flexible, more malleable as you're developing. Again, once it's public, like once you have sort of made a public site, again, I think that URL should work forever restriction comes in where, okay, well, this URL is now known, it's been seen by users. I have to leave a redirect behind in the old place if I'm going to reorganize. But that's not too bad. It's, where'd this go? Right, so if I decide I have to change this to something else, okay, my old code looked like that, so I'm going to have like the new thing, and then this thing is going to be some fun. Again, maybe I have to write a little bit of logic there. I have to like write one line of logic that sends a permanent redirect to the new URL. Maybe my framework can help me and I don't have to write this code myself, but it's not too bad one way or another. It's put a redirect at the old URL and then use the new URL within your own code. It is amazing how long URLs persist. Like, details aside, like I have just undergone an object lesson in this where it's like, look, that has been a permanent URL for like 5 years. Nobody uses that old URL anymore. And I was wrong. Like, I was just wrong. I didn't take my own advice. And I apologize to the consistency gods. Like, I should have taken my own advice and I should have said, nope, that URL has to continue working because, and this was, websites have, other sites have linked to that old URL and users are confused and you lose people and whatever else is going on. Okay, so, we got there, but it was, yeah, like you do have to leave that URL there and, or that redirect there. And, forever is the right timeline to target for that, frankly. Oh, the demo that the thing that I just did, it was on my next slide. Yeah, sorry. Django can help you. Like, you don't have to write this function that returns a permanent redirect yourself. There's a thing for that, which is, I guess if I'm going to stay consistent here, it's probably that. I guess it's something like that. Anyway, the details aren't important. What matters is there's this helper that is like, just send the user a redirect to the other thing instead, please, thanks. Or again, in Express, well, I guess in Express you're giving an arbitrary function here, so you can just write the one-liner function very easily. That is, redirect, 301 permanent redirect. I want to take a break. I've managed my time poorly. Okay, I'll say a few more things here before I take a break. Okay. This is something I was doing actually as I was giving example URLs. I guess none of them survived in my text editor here, but what I don't want is this, right? This thing that is probably the primary key in the database. I don't want it leaking into my URL. I don't care about it as a user. I care about my database having a primary key as a developer. As a user, well, I'd like something more meaningful to be in my URL, please. And thus slugs. Okay, I don't need, like, what the database primary key is doing here. I mean, the reason it ends up there often by default is it has these properties. It's safe to put in a URL. Like, if I turn an integer into a string, like, those are URL safe characters. That's great. I can look it up. Like, of course, what's implied here is that there's some table, there's some table of users or people, and there's a primary key, and I can look up people by primary key. But it's not the only thing that has those properties. A slug is something that is designed to have those properties. A slug, just as an aside, like slug in this context, I think comes from the Django world. It's from the newspaper industry, which is the Django framework is itself. Like the original developers were working at a newspaper, on a site for a newspaper. And I think in the newspaper context, like citation needed, a slug is something like that sort of abstract name for a story that before you have the proper headline, right? It's like, oh, the story about the town festival or whatever. So like town festival story. It's that identifier that's used kind of behind the scenes. That's kind of a little bit meaningful, I think, is the way slug is used, again, traditionally by non-web developers. But for us, a slug, and this is leaked into other frameworks as well, it has to be an identifier. Like, so it's something I can put in the URL that will let me look up a record. And again, like this is in the database sense, let me look up a record. Probably it's indexed in the database so I can look it up quickly. And so the primary key has these properties, but not this one. I would like it to be something a human being can look at and kind of say, oh yeah, okay, I kind of know what this URL is all about now. Maybe you just have something, right? So something like, I mean, back here, I've been kind of like, I think I can infer from my example that probably I'm using user ID or username in that spot. This is one, like, be cautious on this one. Like, this is one because I've been burned by this personally. Oh, we can use username to identify a person at SFU and just put it in the URL, and you'll see that, you know, in various places like in courses or whatever. Totally makes sense. Does everybody have a URL? Oh, mine. A username? No. Right. So people get hired by the university and they exist. They are humans, and they end up coming into computer systems as like, hey, new person that needs to get paid or whatever, before IT services has assigned them a username. So these, what I'm saying here is these natural identifiers that are human readable, maybe be cautious about them. Maybe ask some really hard questions about, is it real? Like, is this really unique? Is it really unchanging? Is it really there for every person? Often the answer for natural values like this is no on at least some of those axes. Again, does it change? Do SFU usernames ever change? And if you ask somebody this, like in IT services, they'll say no, nobody's user ID ever change or username ever changes. And then somebody's username changes in the database, and they say, well, I mean, but they just started, like they were new. They hadn't used it for anything yet. Well, but it was in the database for a month. And then you changed it. Okay, so what you're saying is usernames do change. All right. But you're not even usually that lucky, if I can move on here. And you end up constructing one of these from something else. Okay, now that is probably a good time to take a break. Yeah, I'll come back in about 10 minutes or so, and I'll keep talking about this. See you in a little bit.